Hello, let's take this as a chance to review the study guide 2. So we have been looking at the skeletal system and the muscular system. And here we start with the parts of a long bone. Remember, epiphysis was the end part of a long bone that can either be proximal, so close to the starting part of a trunk, for example, as seen on this diagram as B. Or it can be distal, so further end, away from the start, seen on this diagram as I. Diaphysis instead is the shaft portion, so the long middle part. In this diagram, it's seen as C. Then remember that long bones grew from the growth plates. These are specialized bands of cartilage located at the ends of children's bones. They produce new bone, allowing for growth in length and width. This is shown in the diagram as E. After plates stop growing and harden into solid bone, we call them epiphyseal lives. This generally occurs at the end of puberty, typically between the ages of 13 to 15 for girls or 15 to 17 for boys. Then remember that we had medullary cavity in the central part of a shaft of a long bone. In this diagram, it's H. In this hollow place, we see bone marrow. In younger individuals, this is where red bone marrow, where blood cells form from, is found. And in older adipose, so fat bone marrow, and that's yellow. Remember the outer surface of long bones, shaft, were covered by this dense two-layered connective tissue, and this was known as periosteo. And let's not forget the articulating cartilage at the ends of long bones, so the area known as epiphysis. Where the two bones come together, it helps for these bone ends to slide past each other, protecting from bone-on-bone damage. On this diagram, you see it as D. I think that we already touched on the fact that yellow bone marrow was storage for fat, so adipose tissue within the medullary cavity. And remember formation of blood cells, especially in younger individuals here. And that process is known as hematopoiesis. The term poiesis refers to making of, and hemato to the blood cells in general. On this next page, we see a question referring to our classification system of bones based on their shape. Remember, long like humerus femur, short like carpals, flat like many bones of the skull, and as we see here, ribs, and irregular ones. Remember, the irregular ones were the catch-all group for bones that did not fit into any other categories. Then we had a look of bone markings. There were many, as an example that we see here. Many blood vessels and nerves need to pass through openings of the bones, and these openings were known as foramina. The big hole at the base of the skull through which the spinal cord leaves was foramen magnum. That translates to a big hole. Next, we have some microanatomy and bumps on the surface of the bones where typically because a muscle, a ligament, or a tendon attached to it. So tuberosities were large, rounded, bony prominences that serve as these attachment points. We also talked about fractures. So we could have closed, simple fractures where the bone ends remain aligned and not puncture the skin, although there is a fracture. Or complex or open fractures where the skin is broken and the bone ends are misaligned. How we treat fractures depends on what type of they are. We also divided bones of the body into axial and appendicular. Axial skeleton was made of the skull, thorax, and vertebral column. An appendicular skeleton was made of the bones of the upper and lower limbs. Remember here the transitional areas where we wanted to pay attention. Scapula, so shoulder blade, and clavicle, so collarbone, were appendicular, as were the hips. We discussed the bone growth, and here we get to use the proper terms for some bones. Remember, the femur was the bone of the thigh, largest and strongest in the body. A little pathology. Gout was a good example of that. And finally, joint types. This next page, you get to practice naming different bones. We practice this. Remember, frontal bone formed the frontmost portion of the bones of the face. Remember then tibia and fibula formed the portion of the leg below the knee, with tibia being the one that did most of the weight bearing work. Fibula instead is kind of laterally. For ulna and radius, remember that radius is on the thumb side, and then ulna is on the pinky side. Mandible was the term for the jawbone. Carpals instead was the group of 8 wrist bones. And remember that hip bones were formed by fusion of bones of ilium, pubis, and ischium. On this page, we move on to skeletal muscle. Remember that muscles do generate movement by shortening and lengthening, but by no means is that the only thing that they do. They do a bunch of other things. Like we saw, for example, in generating heat through shivering. We could talk about stabilizing joints and so on. With simple fracture, which we saw earlier, really stabilizing the bone ends so that they can heal is important as long as they are correctly aligned. Remember, compact bone was solid compared to sponge-like spongy bone. Typically, we see compact bone forming the outer portion of the bones, where spongy instead parts of the epiphysis. We also saw that hormones had an important role in the bone regeneration. Parathyroid hormone in particular, releasing calcium through bone breakdown so that new bone could be formed. Our discussion also covered sex differences that we can see on some skeletal parts. It is not always clear and cut, but we look at many features to formulate an educated view. Remember, female pelvis is typically wider, adapted to delivering the baby through the opening. And then atlas and axis were the 2 most superior vertebrae, C1 and C2. The uppermost atlas allowed us to do no movement, and the axis, the one below, the yes movement. And looping back to joint classification, we could do that based on structure, so fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial, or function, so syntharosis, amphiarthrosis, and diaphterosis. Obviously, the synovial joint was the most common and complex, including a fluid-filled cavity. And here we see a really nice diagram explaining how those stripes that we could see on skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue on a microscopic level, how they were caused. Remember how actin and myosin filaments slide past each other as muscle shortens and extends. And remember that muscle was packaged in structures of connective tissue as shown in this diagram. Epimysium is as the outermost, the individual muscle fiber is shown as B, and perimysium have wrapped bundles of muscle fibers together, and endomysium wrapped an individual muscle fiber. Focused on skeletal muscle here, and this was characterized on a cell level with these cylindrical cells with striations and multiple nuclei. Remember, we discussed that many nuclei were the result of many cells fusing together during the development. The contractility referred to the muscle's ability to shorten. And then when a neuron joined the muscle, we saw a neuromuscular junction. This is where we see the small gap between the two, and that was known as a synaptic cleft. Anaerobic referred to the lack of oxygen. Then at the next page, opposing muscles were antagonists. Remember in stories, the antagonist started the storyline where the bad guy or kicked off the story. Orbicularis oris and orbicularis oculi were great examples of circular muscle fascicle arrangement. And finally, muscular dystrophy was a good example of a disease that caused muscles to atrophy and was an inherited one. Finally, we can compare a muscle type. Skeletal was under voluntary control, those cylindrical cells, multiple nuclei at the periphery, and striations. These were the big muscles of the body that we have been learning. Smooth muscle was involuntary, no striations, and often this blob in shape, found, for example, around blood vessels and in the intestines. And finally, cardiac muscle, which was involuntary branch cells, single nuclei, striations, and of course, at those attachments from one cardiac muscle cell to another, we saw intercalated discs. When naming muscles, remember the name told a lot about it: shape, location, size, fiber direction, number of organs, and action were some that we could look. And then the sliding filamentary, we already looked at. Remember, actin and myosin sliding past each other. Calcium was one of those that was involved in many physiological reactions on a chemical level. We saw those also in muscles. Remember, rigor mortis, the stiffening of the muscles after death as a result of actin and myosin heads binding locked because of that calcium. And then we looked at many movements together. So that's all I have for this review sheet. Thank you.